Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz. And this week we're going to talk about identity governance and how to scale identity governance for the whole enterprise. I'd like to introduce our guest, Jim Montgomery. Welcome, Jim.
Hey, thank you. Thank you.
And also Frank Ray. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you.
So we're going to divert from format a little bit, and maybe Jim, you could give us a quick 1 minute intro from your background.
Yeah, so my name's Jim Montgomery. I am the governance practice lead at Triveer. Triveer is a boutique consulting firm that does identity and access management and governance work. We've been around about 20 years. I used to do identity and access management stuff for the US EPA, where actually I was a client of Triveer, and so I joined them after that endeavor. For the last dozen years or so, we've talked with a lot of clients about identity and access management stuff. And then that quickly transitioned into focusing on governance type of work and trying to figure out how do we make governance successful and how do we scale it for some of our larger customers. And so that's what I'm all about.
And Frank, our co-host today is Frank. He's going to help me ask questions and provide additional context. Frank, you want to just give us a 1 minute summary, your life story?
Yeah, awesome. Oh, geez. Okay, I'll do my best.
Okay, maybe just the access and identity part then.
No,
we don't need college.
So yeah, I'm Frank Ray. I'm the director of the identity practice at Templar Shield. I've been in the identity space for now 22 years. I started out as on the customer side for many years. I moved on to consulting. I worked for PwC for a good number of years as well. And then I went back into the customer space where I led an identity team for a large financial institution. And I'm back in the dark side in the consulting space here in the past 2 years. And with Templar Shield specializes in risk, security, cybersecurity, and identity. And I lead the identity practice here. And the reason why we do that is especially as it relates to platform-based solutions, such as on ServiceNow, bringing in all of the risk data and your security operations data and your identity data in one place to be able to provide more insights to the organization. So that's what we do.
Awesome. Okay.
Well, I think I did good. 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to start the conversation. Actually, Jim, you proposed the topic. And one of the things you mentioned in your summary was that it's hard for application developer to onboard new applications. Can you give a little bit of context there? What are those challenges today? What does it look like?
There are a lot of challenges. And so this is a big, long list. So stop me when you're tired of hearing me complain about things. And so, with a governance program, it is very common where you spend a lot of your time onboarding applications into the tool set, right? Because you want to take advantage of the services that it provides. And so this is something that every application owner has to think about in every enterprise where they are in scope for reviews, essentially, and other services that IG provides, like requests and permissions, risk scoring, role mining, all the other stuff that IG does in addition to reviews. So some of the challenges involved with that are simply mechanical, like what is the right protocol to use to get the data extracted from my system into the IG tool? That is a conversation, right? Are we going to leverage an API? Are we exporting stuff from a database? Are we dropping it to CSV? Heaven forbid. What's the right mechanism to get data over? That by itself is a challenge.
When you say data, do you mean the policies, or do you mean what do you mean actually there by data?
Yeah, so with governance, what we're mostly concerned about is collecting two and a half specific things from every application. The first thing is account information, namely, if you have an account inside of an application, we want to consume that and have some record that, oh, there's a Mike Schwartz account, maybe it's M. Schwartz, maybe it has a different name, and we want to be able to link that back to an identity or a common list of all the folks who might have access inside an enterprise. We want to link those two together. So now there's accountability between what access you have as a whole, as an identity, as a person, as a belly button, I like to say, and the access that you have in that specific application. This in and of itself has some complexities because it's a one-to-many relationship, right? You could have service accounts in that system. You could have workforce or what's the term for non-human
Machine
workload
to
type of
machine.
accounts. Yeah, machine identities that
Machine,
non-human
yeah.
accounts could exist there. There's a lot of different things that aren't just your account that you use normally. Maybe your administrative account is a different example. And so pulling all those over, that's task number one. The second task is usually pulling the set of permissions that are available. And I'm using permission in a very generic form because permissions in applications can take, let's just say, infinite
Right.
different shapes,
Right.
right? Could be groups, could be database access. It could be roles. We could call them roles inside the application. It could be any number of things. And those are represented in a lot of different formats. And then the extra half thing that we need to consume is the relationship between permission and those accounts. In other words, who's been assigned those permissions, who is the holder of those rights inside of that system. And that's the difficulty, is the complexity of this model. One of the core things we do with a governance program is try, as part of onboarding, we're trying to map however those permissions are stored, aka the accounts and the permissions and the assignment, back to a standard data model so that we can do useful stuff with it all as one unit.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
So
and let me look, if you don't mind, right there, Jim.
Yeah.
This is one of the areas that I always find interesting, is that you have a lot of the traditional IGA solutions today. They try to flatten the model, right? Because you mentioned it's a complex data model. It's not as simple as, entitlement to account, right? You're dealing with sometimes legacy systems that have a very different model, right? How have you found during your process being able to bring those different types of models, and is flattening the right thing to do, or do you find more of a graph-based model, which I've seen in some other solutions be more effective? What's your take on that?
I'm a fan of the tools that work. I really like some of the new graph systems that are out there. They're doing some really cool stuff, and I think that's honestly the appropriate way to manage this type of data, because it's all about relationships between permissions or rights and accounts, and then between accounts and identities. And managing relationships just works great inside of a graph. It's really performant. It lets you do really interesting queries.
Right.
I use a lot of other tools, though, that are like database backend, where they're just objects and relationships, and we've been modeling those inside databases for generations at this point. So it's been around, and we know how to do it, and it's not that hard. I think from an onboarding standpoint, when you're talking about like what are the things that are difficult and ways to get to a place where you can do more faster and onboard more things, it's really interesting when you start looking at the patterns of how those permissions are stored and realizing, wait a minute, like AD stores it this way, but I have this other directory that it's the same type of model, like it's groups and user accounts. And once you have uncovered similar patterns between different applications, you just leverage the same pattern with that model. Right. So over time, as we get better at realizing, like, oh, this is an Oracle database, they apply roles and permissions the same way as every other Oracle database. Now you have a tool or a weapon to apply to that specific set of applications that fit the pattern, and you can onboard them a lot quicker by learning some of those patterns. Sometimes we have to create these patterns.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're going to be one-offs, but ultimately finding the ones where it's like, wait, these are the same. We can get this extra guy onboarded a lot simpler because we have a good working pattern of how to get it integrated.
You said something interesting in your description, which was that there has been software that's been developed for the last 10 years. And in fact, the case study that you mentioned was for OpenText NetIQ, which is probably 20 years old, if not approaching that. So it seems, I'm an outsider to the identity and access governance area. I've always been in the access management, and those two areas seem to always be adjacent. Thinking back to Sundays, like I'm in the open AM like part of the shop, not on the open IDM part of the shop. Yeah. But it seems to me like one thing that I sort of wish we could have the same stability in the IAM space that the IAG space has, because it seems like really this problem has been around for a long time, and there is an approach that works. And we have SailPoint and Savient and NetIQ and Evolvia Midpoint and now SAS providers.
Mhm.
Is there innovation right now in this space?
Oh,
And if
absolutely.
so, what's driving that innovation that hasn't in the last 10 years?
I think you have to remember that governance has been going on forever, all right? As long as people have been granting rights to things, there's been a mostly manual governance process where I'm pretty sure everybody at this point has seen a spreadsheet of rights in it, and you get some managers to review it, and then they send it back to a central location, and they try and fix this.
I
What?
have some inner office envelope stories, but we won't go there now.
Wow, that you have dated us all by how much I laughed at that. Actually. And so what has changed in the last, starting a decade ago, roughly, maybe a little longer, is like, wait a minute, we can use technology to fix this problem. But what the secret is technology doesn't fix the whole problem. There's quite a lot of parts of a governance program. And what the technology that we have today does is it focuses on the hardest parts of that. For instance, let's collect all the access rights and then provide a business interface, like a user interface where users can review it appropriately and quickly and efficiently. But there are lots of other things that have to do with with ensuring that governance works correctly. And this is part of, and you have to have a handle on all of these to have a successful program, like reviewing your policy as a business. What is it that you think that you should review?
Exactly.
How do you fit your standards and regulation? And
what's the definition of privilege for your organization, right? Privilege access for one organization is completely different than for another.
Absolutely.
Right?
and that's as it should be, right? We want standards and regulations to be flexible to fit the business, but the business also has to make choices about, okay, what is right for us? What is the risk level that we're comfortable with? How much do we want to invest to make this work well? How quickly do we want to get to zero trust and least privilege type of things? Hope to mention some buzzwords from today.
Yeah. well, and that's interesting. I think that, and right before we started, I think that's one of the things we were talking about, Mike, is that I think we are at a point where something you said, right, Mike, is that, we've had solutions that are fairly stable, right? We use similar approach, but I think that there's a negative side to that too, which is we've been doing a lot of governance and administration with identity for far too long and not enough security, right? So we need to look at it from a security angle. And I don't know if you've seen the same thing, and there's more of a question, I think, Jim, but I'll start with a statement that one of the reasons I'm here at Templar Shield is because what I found is that there's silos, right, in the identity space, right? We have the identity teams that are not talking to the risk teams potentially often enough, right? And then there's an audit finding, and now we have to, as identity professionals, figure out how to solve for that. But we're not talking often enough. And the same thing with security operations. There's an incident, and we're not necessarily adding value as identity professionals that data. So one of the things that I've been more concerned about is how to bring all of that together. Security operations and providing data on a more real-time basis to really truly be an identity security profession or identity security. So what do you think of that, Jim? Does that make sense? And are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the modern trends that are really interesting, and I'm going to try and be a little chronological here, is, in the beginning we had really nice interfaces for doing reviews.
Right.
It's like, great. Let's get this data set. Let's throw it. We're going to replace spreadsheets.
Yeah.
Let's make this as nice and efficient as possible. And that was great. That was absolutely great.
Right.
I think the next step beyond that is, okay, now what do we do with the results of this review? Can we fulfill or remediate those changes? And finding good, efficient ways to sync data back into the environment becomes really important, because you don't want to really rely on tickets. That's not always the most efficient. It might be the most cost effective if it's a smaller system we're reviewing, but when you start getting to reviews that make 3, 5, 10,000 changes, you want to try and automate that if you can. So I think fulfillment and remediation is important. Having a single pane of glass for managing the entirety of access management in the organization, not just the reviews, but from a request standpoint. Because when the coolest thing is you've collected this data set of all the access inside your environment. That is an extremely valuable data set. And to be able
Yeah,
to,
and I think people forget how important that is. The fact that
yeah,
you're bringing all of that information in one view, there's a ton of value there, right? Not just from a security perspective, potentially there's business value in
there's
that.
business value to, and I'll get to this in a second,
Yeah,
but
go for it.
mining that for all the interesting things that might be in there that show you trends and outliers and anomalous access, etc. That's an AI thing that I think we're seeing a lot of vendors start to realize, like, wait a minute, we should be doing more with this data set and bringing value back to the business.
Right.
To go back 20 seconds, the single pane of glass for not just approval or reviews, but also for requesting access is really interesting. And so I've been an IT guy for a long time, and it's always been this golden chalice, this ideal end result of figuring out a way where you can grant the business some mechanism where they can request and manage their own stuff. As IT people are always, down in the weeds trying to figure out, like, okay, he needs this access. What are the 13 groups I need to grant him?
Right.
Governance with a request interface on top of it is how we can achieve that golden chalice. This is how we can get to the point where, wait a minute, the business can request, approve, and automatically fulfill access requests. Like changes in job role can now indicate, hey, guess what? We're gonna remove this guy's old access and we're gonna give him the new stuff automatically, with appropriate approval in place. And that is magic. That relieves IT folks from a lot of pressure. It changes. It puts the onus back on the business, which it should have been there, for a long time ago. So I think that's super important. Last thing here's some new feature use cases that we see. Okay, two things. One is a lot more companies are starting to look at analyzing this data set for risk and using the risk scoring for things, and that's super interesting. And then lastly, the forensic use case that you kind of touched on, Frank, of, hey, something happened. We had a breach.
Right.
Let's go look at the users who got affected and see what kind of access they had and what's going on. And that is super cool.
I have a friend, Sean McKinney, I think, from Cymus, who's the author of this product called Apache Fortress, and it's an RBAC tool.
Yeah.
And he loves to remind me that it's deterministic. It will always tell you, did this person have this access at this time? Yes, he did. And it's been reviewed. And so that model of RBAC, I think, is understood by enterprises, and it's understood by application developers. So there's a wide swath of security that you can handle with RBAC. But do you think that there needs to be a new process for building these policies to account for contextual real-time information like risk score? Like, maybe I trust this person with this role, but the risk score is off the wall, so maybe I don't. And how would do any of the governance tools actually have a mechanism to mount to actually for people to review these contextual policies?
That is a complex question there, Mike. I think for myself, I think of governance and the risk of access that is in place. That is a risk score number that is appropriate and important. Personally, I think that is a slightly different type of risk value that you might evaluate for a user during authentication or like during the time of using it. And this includes things like, do I recognize what computer you're coming from, or did you multi-factor already, or are you in the right country, or is it the right time of day, or should you be accessing that thing? You've never accessed that before.
Right. Aren't those things you want to govern, though? Wouldn't you want to govern those types of policies?
And in my mind, well, I think so, but those are a different scope than looking at in-place access or static access grants.
Right.
Saying, when the business says, hey, I want Jim to have access to this database structure, that's totally different than saying, well, I want you to have access to that, but not, from China at 2 a.m. From a machine you've never logged in from before. I think they're both valid. I think they're separate and managed separately by different groups of folks usually.
Yeah, and I think it's bringing that business. It's interesting. It's bringing the business access and the IT access, right? Is there a way to bring those two together? Because what Mike's referring to, right? It's true. It's is there a way to build policies, and those policies need to be governed, right? Because what we're referring to more, I think, Mike, was from a policy perspective, right? Or are you saying more, well, why even leverage RBAC at that? Policies should be in place instead of specific entitlements to define access, and then those policies should be the one reviewed, not necessarily the user's access. Is that kind of what?
Right. Or let's take a specific example. So I'm admin, so I can access this feature.
Mhm.
Um, but because of the risk score, we also want to say that we need to use two-factor authentication.
Right.
Um, and so who gets this? It would seem to me like somebody in the business needs to say, well, there's a policy with this risk score. You need to do, you must have two-factor. So that's the policy that I think developers aren't going to say that. They don't care. So it needs to be, I think, maybe has the scope of the policies really expanded beyond RBAC? And how do we address them?
I think there's two different risk scores involved in that scenario. One is based on the fact that you have a admin role, or you have admin access and a role assigned to you. Maybe you get 20 points on your risk assignment based on the static access that has been granted to you. And somebody periodically reviews, yeah, Mike should probably be admin here. That's right. Separately, at time of access, when you're logging in, we're also evaluating through some orchestration engine to see, like, okay, is this access that he's trying to do right now risky? And those interact, right? The fact that you do have 50 different admin accounts, and maybe you're the riskiest user because if you ever get attacked, the blast radius of what your account could attack and impact, that's huge. And that might play into the decision of, like, well, are we going to let him in? He passed his TOTP check. Is that good enough? And so I think it's two different times. And so a lot of IGA has to do with this time-based review idea of, and keep in mind, this is not the only time you catch inappropriate access and try and push towards least privilege. That should be a day-to-day type thing. But it is a periodic, like quarterly or yearly, let's double check he still has the right rights and we think we know what he should have access to.
Yeah. And I think that there's a place for both. And at the end of the day, to Mike, sort of what you're saying, I think falls into that just-in-time access model, right, today that we have. But I think that there's a challenge on all of these aspects. And one of the things that I've been doing in some of our customers that I've run into, especially when we're talking about RBAC, and kind of going back to RBAC a little bit, that RBAC it may be easy for Jim's team or Frank's team to set up at a customer, but when Frank and Jim leave that customer, we've done our best to train them, right, and to show them how to maintain that, but they may not. And the challenge, what I've gone to is customers of other consulting firms that you go back and they said, well, yeah, they set up an RBAC model for us, but we're hurting because it's taken us longer to manage the roles than to manage the users, right? So I don't know if you run into those type of situations, Jim, and are you, what is the solution to that, and how to manage RBAC is more of is what Mike was saying, a policy-based model, maybe more efficient in some cases, or what's your take on that?
I don't think there's one right model. You got to pick and choose you can use multiple models in the same organization.
Yeah.
From a policy standpoint, I like the idea of rule sets that are such that, hey, based on this job code or job title, we have figured out this job code means this much different functional work, and these are the rights we need to give you. And having that work automatically is chef's kiss. I think you also appropriately still have role-based access of, like, hey, there's this exceptional role we've decided you still need this access to. And so that's the right way to manage that. And so it's a combo. Role management is no simple task. And frankly, it is work to figure out what is the right way to do this. And it's a balancing game between how specific do we want to get in our roles, and also how little hair do we want to pull out as we're managing all of it, right? So there's a difficulty in management versus how specific do we get. And over time, a business is going to ebb and flow with, like, okay, maybe we lean more towards this way, and you go back the other way, and you try and find a happy medium in the middle.
Yeah, and I think, that's the answer at the end of the day too, is there is no right answer for each, there's no cookie cutter option for each organization. And hopefully for those that are listening, That's the reality, unfortunately, of identity governance and administration today, is that there is no one solution that you can find. Just because somebody else, even in your industry, may be using it, doesn't mean that it's going to fit for you the same way. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, Jim, if I can put you on the spot for a second, your proposal said that there's a new approach to identity governance that scales. What were you thinking in that case?
Yeah. And so in terms of scaling, we already touched on the idea of identifying patterns of systems that will follow the same ingestion model, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. I think there are, in terms of onboarding, the real trick is, and we're going to assume that it doesn't matter how much data we're collecting, the system we're shoving into is going to be able to support it. We're not talking about performance of any given IG tool. What we're talking about is how do we onboard systems in the thousands. And so number one is find those patterns of things where you don't have to invest the same amount of time doing the data modeling. But I think there's other aspects as well of figuring out how do we onboard this as quickly as possible. So probably the number one insight that I've got is the team that's doing implementation of the IG tool cannot be the bottleneck. That is a limitation if that team is the only team who's responsible for onboarding things. And so the trick is you need to spread the load, right? Instead of doing one thing with one team, you need to spread the load. And the other people who are part of that spread are the application owners.
Yep.
And so if we can figure out a way in every organization for every IG program, if we can figure out a way to enable application owners to onboard themselves, this and make it enticing for them and sell them on the service that they're going to receive, right? Hey, you're going to have these great reviews. We're going to give you artifacts that'll help you pass audit. We're going to make you more secure. All those benefits to app owners. If we can sell that and help them understand their own policy at the business, and meaning what they need to do, and give them some tools to help them onboard themselves, which may need to be built or might be some workflows we get through our ticket system to help out with these sorts of things. Mm-hmm. That's how we can now we have an army attacking this problem of all the application owners as well. We need to enlist them to assist. That's probably the most significant.
So the technology is not software. The technology is more around business process.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I love what Jim said, because to me, I think that this is important. Is when the identity teams take on the full load of onboarding all those applications on their own, they will likely fail. And I've seen that many times, Jim. So
or burn out.
When you spread that load, so it's better to have solutions that allows those that know about their applications onboard their applications into the solution. It makes you identify privileged access, right? It makes it more effective. Yeah. So did I get that right, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think figuring out what exactly is the service that you want to provide as a IG implementer, right? Setting up a program. Like, okay, part of the service is I want people to be able to do reviews, but another part of that service is quick and easy onboarding. And I'm a big fan of what's the phrase? You get more flies with honey than vinegar, right? I want to provide, I want to enable the app owners. I want to give them a guidance document that shows them, oh, this is what we need to do, and this is why we're doing it, and here's the steps that you need to go through. I want to give them as much help as I can and show them some love, because the alternative is, it's like, hey, let me have the CISO just write an edict and send it down and say, nope, you better get on board, otherwise you're in trouble. It's like that doesn't actually encourage anybody.
More bread and less stick, I guess.
More chocolate.
Yeah, I also want to point, I worked at a large multinational, and we were integrating, I think, 10 apps a year, and we had 100 apps, and we're like, this is going to take us 10 years.
Yeah.
And after year 3 or 4, the guy who was like doing a lot of the work, he's like, please let me do something else, transfer me to a different division. And so, yeah. And then we came up with a different strategy, which was more around self-service, how the application developers can help themselves. And it was better for everybody involved.
Right. You have lived in the ideal situation.
And it leads into my next question. From this conversation, it sounds to me like there's two conflicting challenges here. Well, one is legacy and technical debt, which is hard to justify in ROI. Either you got to improve it or replace it, but it's hard to make a case to improve it. So it's just hard to change it. And then the other immovable force is, let's say, the move to declarative policy. I see this as a huge plus for the authorization and governance industry. And yes, there are 20 authorization companies proposing 15 different standards. Is it relational based? Is it a programming language like Rego? Is it a policy engine, a declarative policy engine like RBAC? I think, my take on it is that, that they all seem to be able to implement different outcomes, but some are more efficient than others. Like maybe sometimes you want to use a SQL database or a tree database. I think in policies, it's a little bit like that. But whatever policy like strategy you have, it seems like there's a move to declarative policies, um, and a move to treating policies like code and code reviewing them. So perhaps that would actually put the obligation of security into the developer. So I guess, Jim, I'll ask you the question. Can we actually let developers write their own policies and just give them guidelines on what those policies should do?
I am hesitant to agree to let IT folks and developers want to manage a policy in that way where we don't have the business aligned with, well, what is this doing and what does it allow? Ultimately, we want the business to be in charge of what is allowed to happen. I'm a huge proponent of this idea of policy-based access, though, because one of the biggest problems we have today is this overwhelming burden on reviewers. Right? We have all this data, and everybody wants it to be reviewed, and it's just this overwhelming amount of systems that we deal with these days, right?
Yeah.
And so using policy to define when should people get access and reviewing the policy at appropriate times saves a tremendous amount of work. And so it's a really brilliant way to reduce the burden on reviewers. But I wouldn't necessarily let just the programmers review it themselves. I want the business to be involved to make sure, like, hey, this really does what we think it should.
I completely agree, and this is something that so there's a little bit of risk, I think, that some people identify on this type of solution, but sometimes a platform-based approach makes sense for something like this, where you can now bring the business analyst, right, and the business to be able to write those policies in and I'm going to use this word and don't shoot me, but in a low code, no code approach, it's possible.
Yeah.
And that's where the platforms such as, and I'm going to plug here for a second, ServiceNow kind of help in that situation, because now you can develop those policies by a less development skilled person that is closer to the business, that understands the business, understands what they're actually doing. And now that they can onboard it in a more meaningful way and identify the key access that's required so that there's less review. The challenge with the wall of I am the business and I am the identity architect, right, is that the translation of the business information to the identity architect may not be clear. And what the reviewer is seeing is the translation of that identity architect on what he understood or she understood was that the business said. And the business may come back, that's not what I said, guys. So you're reviewing the wrong thing, but now you have a reviewer that's reviewing thousands of entitlements, for example, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
you got to catch that.
A low code, no code approach and have you seen that, Jim? Like low code, no code being used? I know it's new. I know there's some solutions out there like Clear Sky that is on the ServiceNow platform that do that. But are you familiar with other solutions?
There's a few vendors out there that have a fairly decent policy engine. I wouldn't say you wouldn't need any like zero training, but it's not you're not writing code or a function or a method or something to make it happen. And that's really amazing, because now with the tool set that supports that in place, now you are enabling the business to kind of manage their own stuff. And that's what we're talking about, is making this easier, shifting it off of the IT folks who are implementing the IG tool,
right?
Really, making it something that the business can manage now.
Yeah, and I think that's a little different too, Mike, from when it comes to the authentication space. Sometimes is that in the authentication space, you have more of the IT folks that want to be on board, and you have to, right? Whereas on the governance side, sometimes we deal a lot with the business, and maybe not. Maybe I'm misrepresenting it. So, but what do you think?
No, I think that's accurate.
Well, I was actually going to pivot a little bit into some of the incumbents. So what I'm hearing is that we need more sort of parallel provisioning in order to eliminate this bottleneck of the governance team reviewing everything. And if we need to, in this new world where we're having a more parallel structure, maybe using some standardized declarative policy syntaxes. I'm just gonna, there's no vendors here, so I'm gonna put you guys on the spot and say, do you think the current incumbents have the tools, or is there a next generation who's developing tools? What's the direction of the vendors, do you think?
I think every single vendor out there is trying to identify how do we make onboarding happen faster. I was at Identiverse last week. This is June 4th, 2024. We're recording this. Last week at Identiverse, there was a vendor that showed and demoed an AI interface to onboard applications where it's a natural language. I'm going to just talk to the interface and tell it what my app looks like. That's
pretty
innovative. Cool. That's pretty cool. Yeah. And I think we're going to see more type of things like that of, it's a huge problem in every program. I heard once the most important metric in a governance program is coverage. And that rings true to me, where you need as many apps onboarded to the tool so that you can get to that single pane of glass type of place. So that's really interesting. The other, since we're talking about Identiverse here slightly, the other really interesting thing I saw is, and you have likely, you can imagine lots of applications where the only type of data you're going to get is CSV, right? They're disconnected apps. They might be SaaS, cloud-based. You can't get to the data set. There's no API or anything you can get to. There's a vendor that has come up with a really nice mechanism to enable app owners to upload CSV to a central location, and then it presents a SCIM interface. And so from your IG tool, it looks like SCIM, but it's really CSVs that are managed by the app. And I think that's really brilliant.
So they're collecting CSVs from applications and then interfacing it SCIM into the enterprise.
You got it. Yeah.
I just have to laugh because it's 2024 and we're still moving CSV files around.
I said exactly the same thing. Yeah. And it kind of irks me that we're dealing with CSVs, but the fact of the matter is they do exist.
That's
and
reality.
You have to address them somehow. Yeah. And this is the first time I saw a vendor hit that, straight on, like, you know what? Great. Let's build an interface where it can be monitored and managed and administered appropriately.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing, and I think we mentioned this earlier, right? I think we're at a turning point where a lot of the solutions, there's different ways of approaching things. You have a few companies out there that are taking a completely different approach, leveraging artificial intelligence in some cases, right? We hear that from vendors. But the fear that I have is that we're going to end up in a world where you have point solutions for each. We got the identity governance solution. We have the your access management solution, right? Each one of it uses its own AI model, but they're not talking. Those AI models are not talking to each other. So I missed Identiverse this year. So that's awful that I did. One of the reasons I missed is because I was at the Knowledge Conference of ServiceNow, and the interesting thing there is they were talking about everything, leveraging the same AI model, right? And different aspects, HR, you're talking about GRC, they were talking about, the customer side, right? It's all leveraging the same model at the end of the day for their business solutions. And I'm thinking, the only thing that's missing here is identity, guys, right? So that's the only thing that's missing.
With so many of these vertical application things, the identity guys are generally missing. We're at Identiverse, but we don't mix with anyone else.
Right. And I'm trying to change it. I'm like, guys, okay. So I didn't know anyone there, by the way. This is the first time I go to a conference and I'm going to different people and I don't know anyone. I don't see Mike there. First month. So, but it was interesting to learn and look at different things from a platform perspective. And that's where I see it's sort of interesting. Microsoft has been doing that for a while. You can almost make that argument, but I think that they're not really doing it at that level. It'll be interesting to see. And there are solutions, like I mentioned, Clear Sky, that are on the platform, right? It's only ServiceNow that provide that IGA experience. But I think that there's more work that needs to be done in the space. And at the end of the day, not every solution is going to fit every organization. It just, because I may not be a ServiceNow customer. Maybe there's somebody that's not using any of the Microsoft stack. They're using Okta. But so it's not every organization is going to be, we're not going to be able to solve everything one way, right?
Yeah, it's this trade-off of, you as an implementer, you want choices, right?
Yeah.
You want to be able to choose, but at the same time, you don't want to be overwhelmed with 48 different flavors of spaghetti sauce on the shelf, right? It's too much. It's like, how do I compare these? And then you get into this paradox problem where there's no single one of them that is the best anymore, because this one has good components, but so does this guy, and this guy's, it just becomes really tough. And ultimately, I like to think about it as, it's not a technology problem, right? We have software that can solve these problems. It's more on the business side and getting people moving in the right direction and agreeing on policy and the right process for a business. And then applying the technology as we have it. I heard a really cool quote a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago. I was listening to a product management podcast by a couple of Red Hatters, and it almost brought a tear to my eye when they're like, hey, we're going to say this quote, and this is very common in the product management space. And the idea is, don't fall in love with the solution, fall in love with the problem.
Yeah.
And that, I spent a lot of time thinking about IGA, and that seemed exactly right. Like, there's a lot of things that we need to make sure are heading the right direction with IGA programs, and the solutions that we're implementing don't fix all of it. And so you have to think more about, like, okay, let's back up. We're implementing a tool set to get things done, but let's back up and think about what are better ways to achieve this, and what's the overall, heuristic, way to accomplish our goals in the future. And that just struck me as a piece of brilliance.
Well, so one of the things I liked about the article that you suggested for the homework was, I saw a lot of business value there. There was no question, if you're not a vendor for the DoD, you will not be able to sell them stuff, and you want to be able to sell them stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the
standard requirements.
value proposition was very clear to me why they were complying. I also thought it was interesting that it was NetIQ, of all of the fancy IDMs out there, SailPoint, Saviynt, et cetera. It was old NetIQ, which was recently acquired by OpenText, was the one that you selected. Could you just talk a little bit about that? About is this like the type of business value that we should be focused on?
Absolutely. And in their case, they were very focused on trying to, they had one problem to solve, which is they had failed an audit. They had some findings and they needed to solve that, but they also needed to meet CMMC requirements, which, if you've been around DoD or contractors to the federal government, those requirements are very similar to like 853 NIST controls, security controls. And so really it came down to AC2, AC5, and AC6, which are account management type of things. Like, you have to review your accounts and the access that they have, and you have to ensure least privilege type of things. And that's exactly what a governance tool can help with. This particular customer had long enjoyed the NetIQ Identity Manager platform, and they have a number of drivers in place. The NetIQ IG product leverages the NetIQ identity management drivers natively. And so since they had drivers in place, it was really easy to do provisioning and deprovisioning, to suck in data, to make changes out into the system using the IG tool. And
so you're using other features of a tool that was already in place. And so the integration was way lower.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a good example of how, there's another layer here that needs to connect, because from the business perspective, they don't care about declarative policy syntax or developer productivity. What they cared about is that they failed these 3 sections of the audit. And so how long do we have to wait maybe before these security reviews catch up to the new types of security that they should be doing? Or are we going to end up complying with some of these RBAC requirements that are written into, things like, SOC 2 and ISO forever?
Yeah. And keep in mind, the security standards don't really change a whole lot. over
Right.
time. Maybe in the past decade, there's more about passkey and and phishing resistant authenticators and whatnot. But for the most part, we kind of know what is an appropriate way to review access
Right.
at this point in time. And I reserve the right to change that opinion, anytime in the future, because who knows what comes out next. And somebody
Yes.
says, this is the way to do it. But we've had manual processes in place for a really long time, and the software is just helping make all that happen.
Any final thoughts? I'll start with you, Frank.
No, this has been great. Thank you for the time, Jim. It's great having this conversation. So I look forward to more of this Identity chats, Mike.
And Jim, any final thoughts before we?
I didn't say the word metrics enough
Oh,
today, and those are just key to selling the solution internally and making sure everybody's on track with what's happening. But other than that, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you putting this together.
Thanks, guys, for joining. And I did hear AI mentioned in this episode. It wasn't the first time, but I think next time will be our first episode on AI. We have two really knowledgeable guests. One guy who's from Okta, who's an identity specialist, and somebody who's just an AI specialist. And hopefully it should be a good conversation on Thursday for everyone who's not at EIC. So thank you guys for joining, and thank you, audience, and we'll see you next time.